There are moments in history when power shifts so quickly, so completely, that everyone who witnesses it spends the rest of their lives trying to explain what they saw. This is the story of one of those moments. It was August 3rd, 1939, just after midnight, and the corner of 142nd Street and Lenox Avenue in Harlem was unusually quiet. Too quiet. The neighborhood's usual Friday night rhythm. Music spilling from the jazz clubs, couples strolling past the late-night diners, numbers runners making their final collections, had been replaced by a tense, waiting silence. Something was about to happen. Everyone felt it. Inside Small's Paradise, one of Harlem's most famous nightclubs, approximately 200 people were packed into a space designed for half that number. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, cheap perfume, and expensive whiskey. The band had stopped playing 20 minutes earlier. Now, everyone was watching the back corner table where 6 men sat in conversation, 3 Italians and 3 black men from Harlem. The Italians had arrived at 11:15 p.m. in 2 dark Buicks, parking directly in front of the club in a way that blocked traffic and announced their presence. They wore expensive suits, fedoras, and the kind of confidence that comes from believing you're untouchable. The leader was a man named Vincent "Jimmy Blue Eyes" Alo, a captain in the Genovese crime family and one of the most feared enforcers in New York's Italian underworld. Alo was 32 years old, born in Harlem to Italian immigrant parents, and he'd risen through the ranks by being smarter and more ruthless than his competition. He had connections to Meyer Lansky, Lucky Luciano, and Frank Costello, the architects of modern organized crime in America. When he walked into a room, people noticed. When he made demands, people complied. Tonight, he'd come to Harlem with a message. The Italian Mafia was taking over. Across the table sat 3 men who represented Harlem's criminal establishment. The most prominent was Stephanie St. Clair, the legendary numbers queen who'd controlled illegal lottery operations in Harlem since the 1920s. She was 41 years old, dressed immaculately in a burgundy dress, and she met Alo's gaze without blinking. Beside her sat 2 enforcers, trusted men who'd worked for her for over a decade. But the person everyone was really waiting for hadn't arrived yet. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was at that moment, exactly 4 blocks away, walking slowly down Lenox Avenue with 3 companions. He was 34 years old, recently released from a 5-year prison sentence, and he'd spent the previous 6 weeks quietly rebuilding his network, reconnecting with old allies, and studying the dramatic changes that had occurred in Harlem during his absence. The most significant change was the Italian Mafia's aggressive expansion into black neighborhoods. Between 1935 and 1939, the 5 Italian crime families that controlled New York had systematically absorbed or destroyed most independent gambling, prostitution, and bootlegging operations throughout the city. In white ethnic neighborhoods, Irish, Jewish, Italian. This consolidation had happened through negotiation, intimidation, and strategic violence. But in Harlem, the Italians had taken a different approach. They assumed it would be easy. They assumed black gangsters were disorganized, undercapitalized, and incapable of serious resistance. They assumed wrong. By the summer of 1939, Dutch Schultz, the psychotic Irish-Jewish gangster who terrorized Harlem in the early 1930s, had been dead for 4 years, assassinated by the Mafia itself for being too erratic and violent. His death had left a power vacuum that the Italians believed they could fill without significant opposition. They'd already taken control of most of Harlem's policy banks, the central operations that managed the numbers racket's money flow. They'd installed their own collectors and enforcers. They'd made it clear to independent operators, work for us or don't work at all. Stephanie St. Clair had resisted longer than anyone else, but by August 1939, even she was under pressure. Her banks were being robbed, her runners were being intimidated, and her political connections, corrupt police officers and local politicians who protected her operation for years, were suddenly unavailable, bought off by Italian money and Italian threats. Tonight's meeting at Small's Paradise was supposed to be her capitulation. Vincent Alo had demanded the meeting, and Stephanie had agreed to it, because refusing would have meant open war, and she knew she couldn't win an open war. But she'd also sent word to Bumpy Johnson, come home. Now, Bumpy had been in prison when Dutch Schultz invaded Harlem. He'd been locked up when the Italians started their takeover. He'd missed the gradual erosion of Harlem's independence, the slow surrender of operators who'd once been proud and powerful. But he was back now, and everything was about to change. When Bumpy Johnson walked through the doors of Small's Paradise at 12:23 a.m., the entire club went silent. Not because he made a dramatic entrance. He didn't. He simply walked in, hands in his pockets, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who knows exactly where he belongs. He crossed the room to the back corner table and stood looking down at Vincent Alo. "You're late," Alo said, not standing, not offering a handshake. "No," Bumpy replied quietly. "You're early." It was a small moment, but everyone in that room understood its significance. Alo had tried to establish dominance through punctuality, through making Bumpy come to him. Bumpy had flipped the script with 6 words, suggesting that this meeting was happening on a schedule, not theirs. Alo's jaw tightened, but he gestured to an empty chair. "Sit." Bumpy didn't sit. Instead, he looked at Stephanie St. Clair and asked, "What are they offering?" 20% of gross revenue, Stephanie said, her voice steady. "They handle protection, political connections, and supply chain. We handle street-level operations." "And if we refuse?" Vincent Alo answered that question. "Then you don't operate at all. We shut down every policy station in Harlem. We make sure no numbers bank can function. And anyone who tries to work outside our system disappears." It was a threat delivered calmly, matter-of-factly, the way you might tell someone the weather forecast. Because from Alo's perspective, this wasn't a negotiation. It was an inevitability. The Italian Mafia controlled the political machine, the police department, the unions, and the supply chains for drugs and alcohol. They had money, firepower, and most importantly, they had organizational structure. What did Harlem have? Independent operators who couldn't agree on anything, street-level gangsters with no political connections, and a population that was systematically excluded from legitimate power. From Alo's perspective, Harlem was weak. Bumpy Johnson was just another street criminal who didn't understand how real power worked. Bumpy let the silence stretch for nearly 30 seconds. Then he said something that nobody expected. "We accept your offer. 20%. Stephanie St. Clair's eyes widened slightly. The 2 enforcers beside her tensed. Because this wasn't the plan. The plan had been to negotiate, to buy time, to figure out some way to resist. But Bumpy wasn't finished. "We accept 20%, he continued, "if you can keep control of Harlem for the next 48 hours without our help." Vincent Alo's expression shifted from confident to confused. "What does that mean?" "It means," Bumpy said, still standing, still calm, "that at midnight tomorrow, every policy station in Harlem shuts down. Every numbers runner stops working. Every collector, every banker, every street operation, all of it stops. And we'll see if the Italian Mafia can run Harlem without Harlem." Now Alo stood up. "You're threatening us?" "No," Bumpy replied. "I'm showing you the reality. You think Harlem is weak because we're not organized like you are. But we're not weak. We're connected. To the community. To the streets. To every barbershop, grocery store, church, and apartment building in this neighborhood. You can muscle your way into our operations, but you can't run them without us. And in 48 hours, you're going to understand that." What happened next was a gamble that could have ended in immediate violence. Alo could have pulled a gun. His men could have started shooting. The meeting could have turned into a bloodbath that would have destroyed any hope of Harlem's independence. But Alo didn't pull a gun, because something in Bumpy's voice, something in the certainty of his challenge, made him hesitate. 48 hours, Bumpy repeated. "If you can keep Harlem running without us, we'll take your 20% and work for you. If you can't, you leave our operations alone, and we operate independently. Deal. Alo should have refused. He should have recognized the trap. But pride, ego, and the absolute certainty that the Italian Mafia could control any neighborhood in New York made him nod. Deal, he said. Bumpy Johnson turned and walked out of Small's paradise without another word. Stephanie St. Clair and her enforcers followed. By 12:45 a.m., the meeting was over. Vincent Alo and his men sat at the corner table, drinking whiskey and laughing about how easily they'd won. They'd forced Harlem's legendary operators to agree to terms. They'd established dominance. They'd proven that the Italian Mafia was in control. But by sunrise the next morning, they'd realized they'd made the worst mistake of their criminal careers. Because Bumpy Johnson hadn't surrendered. He'd set a trap, and in less than 48 hours, the Italian Mafia would learn a lesson they'd never forget. Harlem wasn't weak. It was underestimated, and that was far more dangerous. To understand what Bumpy Johnson did next, you need to understand what Harlem actually was in 1939, not what outsiders thought it was, but what it really was. On the surface, Harlem looked like what white city officials and Italian gangsters assumed it was: a poor, densely populated black neighborhood struggling through the Great Depression, with high unemployment, overcrowded tenements, and pervasive poverty. The numbers suggested weakness. Harlem's unemployment rate in 1939 was approximately 35%, compared to 17% citywide. Average income for black families in Harlem was $1,056 annually, compared to $1,930 for white families in other parts of Manhattan. But those numbers concealed something the Italians didn't see. Harlem had built a parallel economy, a shadow infrastructure that operated entirely outside official channels and mainstream institutions. The numbers racket alone generated an estimated $25 million per year in Harlem by 1939, roughly $550 million in today's currency. That money flowed through hundreds of policy stations, employed thousands of runners and collectors, and touched virtually every business and household in the neighborhood. It was, in effect, an unlicensed banking system, providing credit, loans, and liquidity to a community that had been systematically excluded from legitimate financial institutions. But the numbers racket was just the visible layer. Beneath, it was a complex web of relationships that made Harlem function. Barbershops that served as information exchanges, churches that provided social services and political organizing, rent parties that kept families housed when official assistance wasn't available, jazz clubs that created jobs and attracted tourists, and a network of mutual aid societies that functioned as insurance companies for people who couldn't access traditional policies. This infrastructure wasn't controlled by any single person or organization. It was decentralized, organic, and deeply embedded in community relationships. You couldn't take it over the way you'd take over a business or a territory because it wasn't a business or a territory. It was a culture, a way of surviving and thriving in a society that tried to exclude you. Bumpy Johnson understood this in a way that Vincent Alo never could, because Bumpy wasn't just a gangster. He'd grown up in Harlem, knew everyone, understood the social dynamics, and more importantly, he'd spent 5 years in prison studying exactly how power really worked. The morning after the meeting at Small's Paradise, August 4th, 1939, approximately 6:30 a.m., Bumpy sat in Stephanie St. Clair's apartment on 137th Street, drinking coffee and outlining his plan to a group of 15 people who represented different aspects of Harlem's underworld and above-ground community. There was Stephanie herself, of course. There was Madame Narcisse, who ran a numbers bank that employed over 50 people. There was Deacon Robinson, a Baptist minister who also happened to run one of Harlem's largest policy operations out of his church basement. There was Charles Lucky Roberts, a jazz pianist who owned a nightclub and had connections to entertainers throughout the city. There were 2 police officers, one uniformed, one detective, who'd been on Stephanie's payroll for years. There was a real estate agent who managed properties throughout Harlem. There was a union organizer from the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And there were several street-level operators, enforcers, collectors, and runners who knew every alley and apartment building in the neighborhood. This wasn't a gang meeting. It was a community council. And what Bumpy proposed wasn't a gang war. It was a shutdown. Starting tonight at midnight, Bumpy said, every policy station in Harlem closes. Every runner stops collecting. Every banker stops taking bets. The entire numbers operation goes dark for 48 hours. One of the younger enforcers, a man named Tommy Ridgway, immediately protested. We'll lose hundreds of thousands of dollars. People depend on that income. We'll lose money for 2 days, Bumpy agreed. But we'll prove a point that's worth more than money. The Italians think they can run Harlem without us. We're going to show them they can't. Stephanie St. Clair, who'd been listening quietly, asked the critical question, and what happens when the Italians try to keep the operation running themselves? Bumpy smiled. That's where it gets interesting. Over the next hour, he laid out a plan that was part labor strike, part psychological warfare, and part community organizing. The goal wasn't to fight the Italians directly. That would lead to violence that Harlem couldn't win. The goal was to make Harlem ungovernable, to demonstrate that the Italian Mafia's power was built on cooperation from the very people they were trying to exploit. Here's what would happen. First, every legitimate business owner in Harlem who had any connection to the numbers racket, and that was most of them, would refuse to cooperate with Italian collectors. Barbershops would claim they hadn't seen any runners. Grocery stores would say customers weren't betting. Apartment building supers would say they didn't know anything about policy stations in their buildings. Second, the runners and collectors who actually moved money and took bets would simply disappear. They wouldn't quit dramatically or make announcements. They'd just not show up. The Italians would have no one to work with, no infrastructure to operate through. Third, the community itself would become hostile. Not violently, that wasn't the point, but passively, persistently uncooperative. If Italian enforcers started asking questions, nobody would have answers. If they tried to threaten people, those people would go to the police, specifically to the black officers and white officers who were already being paid to look the other way for Harlem's operations, but who resented Italian intrusion into their territory. Fourth, and most cleverly, information would flow in the wrong direction. False tips about where policy banks were located. Fake leads about who ran operations. The Italians would waste time and resources chasing ghosts. The plan required discipline and coordination that most people assumed Harlem's criminal networks didn't possess. But Bumpy had spent weeks since his release from prison rebuilding relationships, calling in favors, and making it clear that this wasn't just about money. It was about autonomy, about refusing to become subordinate to outsiders who didn't understand or respect the community. Deacon Robinson, the minister, raised a moral concern. Some people in this room are criminals. Some of us aren't. How do we justify this to the community? Bumpy's answer was blunt. The numbers racket employs 3,000 people in Harlem. It provides credit to families who can't get bank loans. It's illegal, yes, but it's our illegal. The Italians want to take it over, not to improve it, but to extract wealth from this neighborhood and move it downtown. That's not justice. That's colonization. It was a political argument as much as a criminal one, and it resonated because it was true. The Italian Mafia saw Harlem as a resource to exploit. Bumpy was positioning himself and Harlem's operators as protectors of the community's economic self-determination. By noon on August 4th, word had spread throughout Harlem. The shutdown was happening. By 6 p.m., every major operator had agreed to participate. By 11 p.m., the final bets had been collected, the final numbers had been drawn, and at midnight, precisely on schedule, Harlem's numbers racket went silent. The Italians didn't notice immediately. Why would they? They'd made a deal. They thought they had control. Vincent Alo and his crew spent August 5th celebrating their victory, drinking in social clubs downtown, bragging about how easily they'd brought Harlem to heel. But by the morning of August 6th, They started receiving phone calls from their own people stationed in Harlem to oversee the transition. The policy stations weren't operating. The runners weren't showing up. The collectors had disappeared. Money wasn't flowing. At first, Alo assumed it was disorganization, typical chaos from amateurs who didn't know how to run a professional operation. He sent more enforcers to Harlem with instructions to get the operation running again. That's when they discovered the truth. Harlem hadn't surrendered. It had gone dark, voluntarily, completely, and there was nothing the Italians could do about it. Because you can't threaten people who aren't there. You can't extract money from operations that have shut down. You can't control a community that refuses to cooperate. For the first time in his career, Vincent Alo faced a problem that couldn't be solved with violence, intimidation, or political connections. He'd been outmaneuvered, and he had less than 40 hours to figure out what to do about it. August 6th, 1939, 9 a.m. Vincent Alo sat in a back room at Gatto's restaurant on Mulberry Street in Little Italy, staring at the 5 men he'd sent to Harlem to manage the transition. They'd just returned with news that Alo didn't want to believe, but couldn't deny. "Everything's shut down," said Tony Benedetto, a 28-year-old enforcer who'd been tasked with overseeing Harlem's policy stations. "The storefronts are open, but nobody's running numbers. The barbershops are cutting hair, but no runners are showing up. It's like the whole operation disappeared overnight." Alo lit a cigarette, his jaw tight. "What about our collectors? We sent our own guys up there." "They can't collect from people who won't bet," Benedetto replied. "We've been walking around Harlem for 2 days asking people where to place bets, and everyone's acting like they don't know what we're talking about." Another enforcer, a man named Sal Rizzo, added, "It's not just the runners. The cops who were supposed to be taking our money, they're suddenly unavailable. The building supers who were supposed to tell us where policy banks are located, they suddenly don't remember. It's coordinated." That was the word that made Alo's hands clench into fists. Coordinated. Because coordination implied organization, and organization implied leadership. And leadership meant this wasn't random chaos. It was deliberate resistance. "Bumpy Johnson," Alo said quietly. Everyone in the room nodded. They'd all underestimated him. They'd all assumed he was just another street-level operator, someone who could be intimidated or bought off. They were learning, too late, that Bumpy Johnson operated on a completely different level. The problem wasn't just that Harlem's numbers operation had shut down. The problem was that the Italians had publicly announced they were taking over. In the underworld, reputation was everything. If word spread that the mighty Genovese family couldn't control Harlem, that a black gangster had outmaneuvered them, it would undermine their authority throughout New York. Other neighborhoods would start resisting. Other ethnic groups would start questioning Italian dominance. The entire power structure that Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and Frank Costello had built in the 1930s would begin to crack. Alo couldn't let that happen. But he also couldn't solve this problem with violence. If the Italians started shooting people in Harlem, it would bring federal attention, newspaper coverage, and political pressure that even their police and political connections couldn't suppress. So what could he do? "We need to get the operation running again," Alo said. "Find people in Harlem who'll work for us. Offer more money. Double what the local operators were paying." But Tony Benedetto shook his head. "We tried that already. People aren't interested, and the ones that might be interested are too scared. Bumpy's people have made it clear. Anyone who cooperates with us won't just lose their job. They'll be blacklisted from every legitimate business in Harlem." It was a brilliant strategy. Bumpy wasn't threatening violence. He was threatening social and economic isolation. In a tight-knit community like Harlem, that was often more effective than physical intimidation. Meanwhile, across town, Bumpy Johnson was sitting in a booth at Jenny Lou's Chicken Shack on 143rd Street, eating lunch and receiving reports from the dozen people who'd been monitoring the Italians' attempts to restart Harlem's numbers operation. The news was exactly what he'd predicted: chaos, confusion, and mounting frustration. The Italians had sent enforcers, offered money, made threats, None of it worked because Harlem had collectively decided not to cooperate. But Bumpy knew this couldn't last forever. The shutdown was costing everyone money. Policy bankers who needed income, runners who depended on commissions, families who played the numbers daily as a small hope against poverty. The community would tolerate this for 48 hours, maybe a little longer, but eventually economic pressure would force people to start working again. Bumpy needed the Italians to crack first. That afternoon, something unexpected happened that would tip the balance decisively in Harlem's favor. The police got involved. Not the corrupt police officers on the Italians' payroll. They were staying quiet, as instructed. The honest ones, or at least the ones who were racist enough to resent Italian gangsters operating in a black neighborhood and smart enough to see an opportunity. Captain James McBride of the NYPD's 28th Precinct, which covered most of Harlem, called a press conference at 3 p.m. on August 6th. McBride was 52 years old, a career cop who'd never risen higher than captain because he refused to play the political games that advancement required. He was also a complicated figure. He'd looked the other way on Harlem's numbers operation for years because he believed it was relatively harmless, but he despised Italian organized crime for what he saw as their corruption of law enforcement. At the press conference, attended by reporters from the New York Age, Harlem's black newspaper, the New York Times, and the Amsterdam News, McBride made a statement that would change everything. For the past 48 hours, we've observed a significant increase in Italian organized crime activity in Harlem. Multiple individuals associated with known crime families have been operating openly in this precinct, attempting to extort local business owners and intimidate residents. As of today, the 28th Precinct is launching a crackdown on all organized crime activity in Harlem, with a particular focus on outside criminal elements. It was bureaucratic language, but the message was clear. The NYPD was targeting the Italian presence in Harlem, not the local operators. This is the moment where everything hinges on timing and perception. If you're fascinated by how someone with no official power can outmaneuver one of the most powerful criminal organizations in history, just by understanding psychology, community dynamics, and the fractures in seemingly invincible systems, then you understand why Bumpy Johnson's story isn't just true crime entertainment. It's a case study in strategic thinking that still matters today. There are more stories like this, waiting to be uncovered, and every one of them reveals something about how real power actually works. The press conference was a calculated move by McBride, but it had been subtly encouraged by two black police officers in the precinct, the same officers who'd attended Bumpy's meeting on August 4th. They'd fed McBride information about Italian movements in Harlem, framed it as an invasion by outside criminal elements, and suggested that a public crackdown would boost McBride's reputation while also protecting community-based operations. Vincent Alo read about the press conference in the evening newspaper and immediately understood the trap he was in. If the NYPD started arresting Italian enforcers in Harlem, it would be humiliating. It would confirm that the Italians couldn't operate in Harlem without attracting law enforcement attention, and it would make the entire takeover attempt look like a failure. But if Alo pulled his people out of Harlem to avoid arrest, he'd be admitting defeat. He'd be proving Bumpy Johnson's point, that the Italians couldn't run Harlem without Harlem's cooperation. That evening, August 6th, Alo made a phone call to Frank Costello, one of the most powerful bosses in the Italian Mafia and someone who'd known Bumpy Johnson for years. Costello listened to Alo's explanation of the situation, then asked one question. "Can you win this without starting a war?" Alo hesitated. "I don't know." "Then you've already lost," Costello said. "Pull your people out. Let Harlem run its own operation. We'll take a percentage as tribute, but we won't try to control day-to-day operations." It was the smart decision, but it was also a humiliating one. The Italian Mafia had publicly announced they were taking over Harlem, and now they were retreating. In the underworld, that kind of retreat was almost as damaging as an outright military defeat. But Costello understood something that Alo didn't. Power is only real when it's sustainable. You can force someone to submit through violence, but if you can't maintain that control without constant conflict, you don't actually have power. You just have a problem. At 11:47 p.m. on August 6th, 13 minutes before the 48-hour deadline Bumpy had established, Vincent Alo walked into Small's paradise, where Bumpy Johnson sat in the same corner booth where they'd met 2 nights earlier. This time, Alo didn't sit down. He stood at the table and spoke quickly, his pride visibly wounded but his voice controlled. "You win," he said. "We'll leave Harlem alone. You operate independently. We want 10% tribute on gross revenue, paid quarterly. No interference in your day-to-day operations." Bumpy, who'd been expecting this conversation but hadn't been certain it would come, nodded slowly. 15% tribute was what Stephanie paid Dutch Schultz when he tried this same thing in 1932. "We'll match that, but you stay out of Harlem. No collectors, no enforcers, no involvement." Alo wanted to argue, but he couldn't. He'd lost the leverage. "Agreed," he said. And just like that, it was over. The Italian Mafia's attempt to take over Harlem had failed, not because of violence, but because Bumpy Johnson had proven that Harlem's strength wasn't military. It was structural. It was built on relationships, trust, and the ability to collectively resist outside control. By midnight on August 6th, 1939, Harlem's numbers operation quietly restarted. Policy stations reopened. Runners returned to work. Money began flowing again. But everything had changed. Because overnight, literally overnight, Bumpy Johnson had transformed himself from a recently released ex-convict into the most powerful black gangster in New York. And he'd done it without firing a single shot. August 7th, 1939, the morning after the shutdown ended. Word spread through Harlem faster than any newspaper could print. They'd won. The Italian Mafia had backed down. Bumpy Johnson had outmaneuvered Vincent Alo and the Genovese family without violence, without casualties, without the kind of war that would have devastated the neighborhood. But Bumpy understood something that most people celebrating in the streets didn't. This wasn't a permanent victory. It was a temporary arrangement, and if he didn't consolidate power quickly, the Italians would simply wait for him to make a mistake and try again. Over the next 2 weeks, Bumpy Johnson did something remarkable. He reorganized Harlem's entire criminal infrastructure in a way that made it resistant to future takeover attempts. First, he formalized the relationships between independent operators. Before the shutdown, Harlem's numbers racket had been fragmented. Dozens of independent policy banks, each operating autonomously, sometimes competing against each other. Bumpy created a loose confederation, a council of major operators who would meet monthly, share information, and coordinate on issues that affected everyone. It wasn't exactly a gang or a crime family in the Italian sense. It was more like a trade association. But it provided structure, communication, and collective bargaining power that had been missing before. Second, Bumpy invested heavily in political connections. He'd watched the Italian Mafia operate for years, and he understood that their real power didn't come from violence. It came from owning politicians, judges, and police captains. Harlem couldn't match the Italians' political connections citywide, but it could dominate local politics in its own neighborhood. Bumpy began funneling money, clean money, laundered through legitimate businesses, into the campaigns of local city councilmen, state legislators, and community organizations. He supported candidates who promised to fight police brutality, improve housing conditions, and expand social services. These politicians might not have known exactly where the money came from, but they knew it came from Harlem, and they knew they needed it to win elections. This created a protective layer. If the Italians tried to move against Harlem's operations in the future, they'd be fighting not just gangsters, but elected officials, community leaders, and legitimate organizations who had a vested interest in maintaining Harlem's autonomy. Third, and most importantly, Bumpy made himself indispensable to the Italian Mafia, even while maintaining independence. Here's where Bumpy's strategic genius really showed. He didn't try to completely exclude the Italians from Harlem. That would have made them permanent enemies. Instead, he created a system where Italian interests and Harlem's interests were aligned enough that neither side wanted conflict. The 15% tribute that Harlem paid to the Genovese family was structured as quarterly payments, delivered on time, with transparent accounting. Bumpy personally ensured that the payments were reliable, because reliability built trust. The Italians might not have liked getting 15% instead of the 80% they'd hoped for, but 15% of a smoothly running operation was better than 0% of chaos. Additionally, Bumpy began acting as a broker for Italian interests in Harlem that didn't directly compete with local operations. When Italian-owned distribution companies wanted to sell beer and liquor to Harlem's speakeasies and restaurants, Bumpy facilitated those deals, taking a small percentage for himself, but ensuring the Italians made money. When Italian loan sharks wanted to operate in Harlem without getting robbed or killed, Bumpy provided protection for a fee. He was creating what modern business theorists would call a strategic partnership, mutual dependence that made conflict too expensive for either side. Frank Costello, the Italian boss who'd advised Vincent Alo to retreat, recognized what Bumpy was doing and respected it. In October 1939, Costello invited Bumpy to a private meeting at a restaurant in Midtown Manhattan. Not a negotiation, but what Costello described as a conversation between professionals. Over dinner, Costello made an observation that would define the next 20 years of Bumpy's career. "You're smarter than most of the Italians I work with. You think long-term. Most street guys only think about next week." It was a compliment, but also a warning. Costello was signaling that Bumpy had earned respect, but also that he'd be watched closely. Any sign of expansion outside Harlem, any attempt to build power that threatened Italian operations in other neighborhoods, and the arrangement would end. Bumpy understood the boundaries being drawn. He would dominate Harlem, not just the criminal economy, but the social and political infrastructure. But he wouldn't expand beyond it. He would be a king in his own territory, but he would remain in his territory. For someone as ambitious as Bumpy Johnson, this should have felt like a limitation. But Bumpy didn't see it that way. He saw Harlem not as a restriction, but as a foundation. If he built his power base strong enough, deep enough, he could leverage it for influence far beyond the neighborhood's physical boundaries. And that's exactly what he did. By late 1939, Bumpy Johnson was arguably the most powerful black gangster in America. He controlled Harlem's numbers operation, had working relationships with the Italian Mafia and Jewish crime syndicates, and had political connections that extended to City Hall. He employed hundreds of people directly and thousands indirectly. He was feared, respected, and increasingly seen as a community leader, albeit a criminal one. But there was a cost to all of this that wouldn't become fully apparent until years later. The numbers racket, for all its economic importance to Harlem, was still illegal gambling. And illegal gambling was just the beginning. Over the next decade, as heroin began flooding into New York through Italian-controlled distribution networks, the same infrastructure Bumpy had built to protect Harlem's independence would be used, sometimes against his wishes, to distribute narcotics that would devastate the community. Bumpy would resist heroin distribution personally for years, believing it was morally wrong and strategically stupid. But he couldn't control everyone in the network he'd created, and by the 1950s, Harlem would be drowning in addiction. That's the tragedy hidden inside the triumph. Bumpy Johnson saved Harlem from Italian domination in 1939. He proved that black communities could resist exploitation and maintain autonomy. He built political and economic power in a neighborhood that had been systematically excluded from both. But the infrastructure he built, the networks, the connections, the financial systems, would ultimately enable the very destruction he'd tried to prevent. Still, in August 1939, none of that was visible yet. In August 1939, Bumpy Johnson had just proven something that the Italian Mafia the NYPD and white America generally didn't want to believe that black communities weren't weak. They weren't disorganized. They weren't incapable of strategic thinking and sophisticated resistance. They'd just been underestimated. And Bumpy Johnson had spent one night, 48 hours, and a lifetime of preparation proving everyone wrong. The immediate aftermath of the August 1939 standoff reshaped not just Harlem, but how organized crime functioned across racial boundaries in American cities for decades. By September 1939, word had spread throughout the criminal underworld. A black gangster in Harlem had outmaneuvered the Italian Mafia. The story grew with each telling, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes minimized, but always noted. In Chicago, in Philadelphia, in Detroit, in every city where Italian crime families were expanding into black neighborhoods, the Harlem example became a reference point. Some black operators tried to replicate Bumpy's strategy. Most failed because they lacked either the community support, the strategic patience, or the political connections that had made Harlem's resistance possible. But a few succeeded, creating pockets of autonomy that complicated the Italian Mafia's assumption of total control. For Bumpy Johnson personally, the victory came with immediate benefits and long-term complications. The benefits were obvious: money, power, and respect. By late 1939, Bumpy was earning an estimated $50,000 per year from his share of Harlem's numbers operation alone, roughly $1.1 million in today's currency. Add in his other interests, protection rackets, illegal gambling houses, legitimate business investments, and his annual income likely exceeded $100,000, making him wealthier than 99% of Americans during the tail end of the Great Depression. He invested carefully. He bought real estate in Harlem, apartment buildings that provided both income and housing for people in his network. He opened legitimate businesses: a dry cleaning service, a taxi company, a funeral home. These weren't just fronts for money laundering. They were actual businesses that employed community members and provided services. Bumpy also became, paradoxically, a kind of unofficial community leader. He funded youth programs, donated to churches, paid for funerals when families couldn't afford them. It was partly pragmatic. Maintaining community loyalty was essential for his power, but according to people who knew him, it was also genuine. Bumpy believed in Harlem, believed in the potential of black economic and political self-determination, even if his methods for achieving it were criminal. But the complications were significant. First, Bumpy had made powerful enemies. Vincent Alo never forgot the humiliation of being outmaneuvered in Harlem. Though the formal agreement held, the Italian stayed out of Harlem's day-to-day operations. Alo and other Italian gangsters looked for opportunities to undermine or eliminate Bumpy whenever possible. Several attempts on Bumpy's life occurred between 1940 and 1945, all of which he survived through a combination of luck, excellent security, and informants who warned him in advance. Second, federal law enforcement began paying attention. The FBI and Treasury Department had largely ignored Harlem's numbers operation in the 1930s. They were focused on Italian organized crime, bootlegging, and bank robbery. But Bumpy's success made him visible, and visibility in the criminal underworld eventually attracts government attention. By 1942, the IRS had opened a tax evasion investigation into Bumpy's finances. By 1944, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who was obsessed with targeting black political activists and criminals he believed threatened American society, had personally ordered surveillance on Bumpy Johnson. The investigation would drag on for years, resulting in Bumpy's arrest and conviction in 1951 on narcotics conspiracy charges. Third, and most importantly, Bumpy's success in protecting Harlem's independence didn't protect Harlem from internal problems. The numbers racket, while economically important, was still extracting money from one of America's poorest communities. Yes, some of that money circulated back through jobs and services, but much of it flowed to operators who lived well while their customers stayed poor. And when heroin arrived in Harlem in the late 1940s, imported by Italian-controlled networks through the French Connection, Bumpy's infrastructure, built to protect the numbers operation, became a distribution channel for drugs. Not directly through Bumpy himself. He resisted narcotics trafficking until his death, but through younger operators who saw heroin as more profitable than policy wheels. By 1950, Harlem was in crisis. The heroin epidemic had exploded, addiction rates were soaring, and the neighborhood's social fabric was tearing apart. The very autonomy Bumpy had fought for in 1939 had created space for internal predation that was arguably as destructive as Italian domination would have been. This is the uncomfortable truth about Bumpy Johnson's legacy. He was simultaneously a protector and an exploiter, a community leader and a criminal, someone who fought against external oppression while enabling internal destruction. The question historians still debate is whether Bumpy Johnson could have been different. Could he have built Harlem's power without criminal activity? Or was the criminal underworld the only avenue for black economic power in 1930s America? The answer is probably somewhere in between. Legitimate paths to economic power were systematically blocked for black Americans in the 1930s through racist laws, discriminatory lending, employment restrictions, and political disenfranchisement. The numbers racket wasn't just criminal opportunism. It was one of the few ways for black entrepreneurs to accumulate capital in a society designed to prevent that accumulation. But Bumpy Johnson also made choices. He could have used his influence to push for legitimate business development more aggressively. He could have resisted all narcotics trafficking more forcefully. He could have transitioned Harlem's underground economy toward less destructive activities. He did some of that, but not enough. And the result was a neighborhood that remained economically and politically marginalized, even as its most famous criminal became a legend. Still, what Bumpy accomplished in August 1939 remains historically significant. In one 48-hour period, using nothing but strategic thinking, community organizing, and an understanding of power dynamics, he forced one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world to back down to IT wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was a complicated, morally ambiguous victory that created as many problems as it solved. But it was real, and it proved something that resonated far beyond Harlem streets. That underestimated people are often the most dangerous, because they've learned to survive with intelligence rather than force, with strategy rather than resources, with unity rather than individual power. By the time Bumpy Johnson died on July 7th, 1968, at age 62, his life had become inseparable from mythology. He'd spent much of the 1940s and 50s in and out of prison, arrested on weapons charges, narcotics conspiracy, and various other offenses. He'd served time in Sing Sing, Alcatraz, and several other federal facilities. Yet even from prison, his influence in Harlem remained substantial. Other operators consulted him on disputes, asked his advice on strategy, and maintained his interests while he was incarcerated. When he died of a heart attack while eating dinner at Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue, hundreds of people attended his funeral. The event was covered by the New York Times, the Amsterdam News, and even got brief mentions in national publications. Adam Clayton Powell Jr., Harlem's legendary congressman, reportedly attended, though he never confirmed it publicly. The mythology around Bumpy had already begun forming during his lifetime, but it accelerated after his death. He was portrayed as a Robin Hood figure who protected Harlem from white gangsters. He was described as a chess master who outthought everyone. He was romanticized as the epitome of black resistance against institutional racism. Some of that mythology was true. Some wasn't. The reality was more complicated and, in many ways, more interesting than the legend. Bumpy Johnson was brilliant strategically. That's undeniable. The August 1939 standoff proved he could outmaneuver sophisticated opponents with limited resources. But he was also violent when necessary, ruthless with enemies, and willing to hurt people who crossed him. He did protect Harlem from complete Italian domination, which likely prevented even worse exploitation. But he also profited enormously from illegal activities that hurt his own community. The numbers racket, while less destructive than heroin, still drained money from families who could barely afford it. He did build political and economic infrastructure that gave Harlem a degree of self-determination unusual for black neighborhoods in mid-20th century America. But he also operated outside legal systems, which meant those gains were fragile and couldn't be institutionalized or protected through law. Perhaps the most important thing to understand about Bumpy Johnson is that he was a product of his circumstances, someone who saw the legitimate paths to power systematically blocked by racism and chose an illegal path instead. He wasn't unique in that choice, but he was uniquely successful at it. The August 1939 standoff remains the defining moment of his career because it crystallized everything he understood about power, that it's relational rather than absolute, that perception matters as much as resources, that unity and strategy can overcome superior force, and that understanding your opponent's weaknesses is more important than emphasizing your own strengths. The Italian Mafia thought Harlem was weak because they measured strength in money, weapons, and political connections, all areas where they had advantages. But Bumpy measured strength in community cohesion, local knowledge, and the ability to make Harlem ungovernable without Harlem's cooperation. He was right, and they were wrong, and that miscalculation cost them control of the most economically important black neighborhood in America. The lessons from August 1939 extend beyond organized crime. They're relevant to labor organizing, political resistance, community activism, and any situation where a less powerful group faces a more powerful opponent. The fundamental insight that you don't have to be stronger than your enemy, you just have to make victory more costly than compromise, is timeless. But so is the warning embedded in Bumpy's story. That victories won through illegal means are inherently unstable. That power built on criminal activity eventually attract consequences, and that protecting your community from external threats doesn't automatically protect it from internal ones. Bumpy Johnson proved the Italian Mafia wrong in August 1939. He saved Harlem's independence and built a power base that lasted decades. But he couldn't save Harlem from poverty, addiction, or the systematic racism that made criminal activity seem like the only path to power in the first place. That's the tragedy beneath the triumph. And it's why, more than 80 years later, Bumpy Johnson's story still matters. Not as a simple tale of gangster heroics, but as a complicated, morally ambiguous case study in how power really works, what it costs, and what it can and cannot achieve. The events of August 3rd to 6th, 1939 didn't just affect Harlem or Bumpy Johnson. They fundamentally altered the relationship between Italian organized crime and black communities throughout urban America. Before Harlem's resistance, the Italian Mafia's expansion into black neighborhoods had been largely unopposed and complete. After Harlem, it became negotiated and partial. Black operators in other cities now had a template for resistance, and Italian bosses had learned that total control wasn't always possible or even desirable. By the mid-1940s, a pattern had emerged in most major American cities. Italian crime families controlled the import and distribution of drugs and other contraband, while black gangsters controlled street-level operations in their own neighborhoods. It wasn't equality. The Italians still had more money, more political power, and more violence capacity. But it was a working arrangement that acknowledged black criminal operators as partners rather than subordinates. This shift had enormous implications. It meant that black communities, while still criminalized and exploited, had some degree of economic autonomy within the illegal economy. It meant that money generated in black neighborhoods stayed there more than it would have under complete Italian control. And it meant that black political and community leaders could negotiate with, and sometimes manipulate, both legitimate government and organized crime to advance community interests. Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., Harlem's congressman from 1945 to 1971, understood this dynamic and used it brilliantly. He maintained relationships with both Bumpy Johnson and Italian mob bosses, playing them off against each other to fund community programs, protect black businesses, and build political power. It was morally questionable, legally problematic, and politically effective. But the most lasting impact of August 1939 was psychological. Bumpy Johnson had proven that intelligence, organization, and community solidarity could overcome superior resources. That lesson resonated far beyond the criminal underworld. When the civil rights movement accelerated in the 1950s and 60s, the strategies it employed, economic boycotts, community organizing, making segregation more costly than integration, echoed the principles Bumpy had demonstrated in 1939. The Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, for example, worked because black residents collectively refused to cooperate with a system that exploited them, making that system economically unsustainable until it changed. There's no direct line connecting Bumpy Johnson to Martin Luther King Jr. or Rosa Parks. The civil rights movement was fundamentally about moral justice and legal equality, not organized crime. But the underlying strategic principle was similar. Unified resistance by an apparently powerless group can force powerful institutions to negotiate. Today, Bumpy Johnson is remembered primarily through popular culture. Movies, TV shows, books that romanticize or demonize him, depending on their perspective. The 2019 TV series Godfather of Harlem portrayed him as a complex anti-hero. The 2007 film American Gangster featured him as a mentor to Frank Lucas, though that relationship is historically disputed. But the real Bumpy Johnson was neither hero nor villain in any simple sense. He was a man who navigated impossible circumstances with intelligence and ruthlessness, who protected his community while exploiting it, who built power in a society designed to deny him power, and who proved that being underestimated is sometimes the greatest advantage of all. The Italian Mafia thought Harlem was weak on August 3, 1939. By August 6th, they'd learn otherwise. And that lesson, that intelligence and unity can overcome force and resources, remains relevant more than 80 years later. Not because we should celebrate criminal activity, but because we should understand the strategies that actually work when facing overwhelming power. Bumpy Johnson spent 48 hours teaching the Italian Mafia that lesson. And in doing so, he changed not just Harlem, but the entire landscape of American organized crime. His methods were illegal. His morality was questionable. But his strategic genius was undeniable. And on one August night in 1939, that genius proved the Italian Mafia wrong. Overnight,